My folks made me reside in the garage, while my special brother was given 2 rooms. When they desperately needed a place to stay after the storm, I mentioned the garage was still free. You know how sometimes things just seem wrong, but you can't quite pinpoint why. It's like there's a tiny piece that doesn't match up, almost unnoticeable unless you're really paying attention. That feeling was a constant as I grew up in my childhood home. Initially, it wasn't a huge, obvious problem. It was more like little instances, a subtle observation here and there. Now that I think about it, I realize there was an unspoken conflict. Between my brother and me, I couldn't express it at the time. We were a family, supposedly. Correct, but the more I reflected on it, it felt like there were completely different standards. In our household, I recall the initial moment I realized something was off. I was about 12 years old. And my brother Ezra was 9. We had just moved into a new house, and although it was bigger, my parents informed me I would live in the garage. They explained it was because I was older, so I'd need more private space. The garage was as good as any room. It was close to the main living area, and I'd have my own space. No big deal, right? But that wasn't the complete truth. I wasn't actually getting more privacy. I was getting less space than Ezra. And not just a little less, a whole lot less. In other words, my brother had 2 entire rooms, one for sleeping and the other for his things. I ended up setting up in the garage instead of the playroom, which they said was okay, that I could have my own space to get things done. Honestly, at first it didn't really bother me that much. After all, I was the older brother, and I thought I was old enough to deal with whatever came my way. But little by little, a few things began to irritate me. One day I asked my mom, Melanie, if I could possibly move into one of the spare bedrooms in the house. It wasn't like I was demanding something outrageous or anything. I was just getting sick of hearing the groaning of the garage door every time I tried to sleep, and I wanted to feel like I was included in the family. It felt like I was living in an outbuilding of some kind. My mom was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, and I figured it was a good moment to bring it up. I said, "Mom, I've been thinking maybe I could have one of the bedrooms inside." Just for a change, somewhere not as garage-like, I said, trying to sound like it wasn't a huge deal. But even as I was saying it, I could tell by the look on her face that it was a big deal. "Hudson," she sighed, drying her hands on a towel, "we've already discussed this. Ezra needs more room for his things. You know how vital his art is. It's not just about the room, it's about giving him the right setting to concentrate." I just stood there trying to process it all. His art. I wasn't even permitted to keep art supplies in the garage, let alone get an art studio like Ezra had. He had all kinds of stuff, fancy easels, special lights, and piles of canvases. Everywhere I looked, there I was, attempting to complete school assignments at a flimsy desk. Without even glancing my way, she spoke those words. "You're okay, sweetie, you have your own area, it's beneficial." She suggested that I view it as my personal sanctuary. However, it didn't feel like a retreat to me. It felt like I was an afterthought. I didn't bother to debate it after that. What would be the use? I was only 12, and my mother was the one establishing the guidelines. Yet as the weeks turned into months, the injustice of the arrangement began to really bother me. I don't go by Ezra's rooms, the 2 rooms he had, without feeling an odd knot in my gut. It was more than just envy. I couldn't figure out why he needed so much. Why did I get the garage while he had a pair of rooms? One particular evening really stands out in my mind. Ezra had some of his pals over. They were shouting with glee, tossing pillows, and creating a mess in the living room. I was situated in the garage, making an effort to concentrate on my schoolwork, but it was beyond challenging. The din emanating from the house felt like it was smothering me. I could hear them all having a great time as I sat there all by myself, in the chilly space, with hardly any light. I went inside, hoping to find a snack or something to help me focus, and as I passed through the kitchen, I saw my folks at the table with Ezra. While his friends were still playing in the living room, my mom and dad were gazing at him, a peculiar combination of pride and worry on their faces. It seemed like they were having a heavy conversation about. I was listening to snippets of his aspirations and what he was hoping to achieve. Ezra, been really driven recently. His artistic efforts are really succeeding. We should definitely support him. My dad, Dylan, mentioned something, and I was momentarily still. I had no clue Ezra was so invested in art. I knew he did some drawing occasionally, but I never considered it that significant. Why had this suddenly become something everyone was being careful around? I paused for a second, and then without thinking, I spoke up. "I don't understand. Why does he require 2 rooms for his art? I don't even have one." Everyone went silent, and my pulse sped up. My mom's expression changed as if she felt responsible for something. I was hoping to hear some sort of clarification. However, instead, she simply gave me a long-suffering sigh, as if this was a repetitive discussion they were tired of revisiting. "Sweetheart, you know Ezra requires extra support, yes," she said quietly, as though addressing a child who just didn't get it. "His requirements are different from yours." I felt completely devastated. "Special needs?" I echoed, my voice wavering a bit. "I don't have special needs." Ezra gazed at me from across the room, and for the first time I felt like he was genuinely bewildered. It wasn't that he was intending to be hurtful, but I could tell from his expression that he didn't comprehend why I was so upset. My parents had never clarified it to him. They had never explicitly discussed it, but in that moment, I noticed the way they acted around him was different, and it made me feel like I had to justify myself. Instead of staying, I left the conversation. I retreated back to the garage, and I made sure to slam the door as hard as I could, regardless of who might hear it. I couldn't get rid of the notion that everything I'd always been taught about things being fair, about family ties, was a complete fabrication. Truthfully, I didn't have a clue what I should do about it at that point. I was starting to get the impression that I didn't really belong in my own house. My brother got 2 rooms, including the garage, but I wasn't going to let this injustice continue. That's when I made up my mind to finally speak up. I recall the first time I returned from college after a semester's worth of time spent away. It wasn't the normal joy of being home. It was like returning to a familiar, unpleasant room I'd been putting off for too long. I could still get a whiff of the faint scent of old wood and dust from the garage, mixed with that peculiar, cold air that always seemed to hang around, no matter how much I tried to warm it up and make it feel like a real room. But that's the way it was. It wasn't a real room. It was just a space that existed, an afterthought, and I was absolutely fed up with it. When I walked in, Ezra was on the couch in the living room, casually looking through his sketchbook. He didn't even bother to glance up when I came in, so engrossed in his drawings. It was immediately obvious that nothing had shifted, that nothing would change. The whole house still centered around him, his needs, his gifts. It felt like everything revolved around Ezra and his special talents, and I was just an observer. Mom was in the kitchen, doing what she always did when I visited, cooking and scurrying about as if she had to justify her existence. It wasn't that I disliked her for it, but the kitchen always felt like her domain, not mine. It was like she always kept me at a distance, a little removed. "Hudson, how was the semester?" she asked, her voice bright, pivoting around with that forced enthusiasm she always used when she was anxious. "It was all right," I replied, putting my bag on the floor in the hallway. You know, the same old story. Something in her voice, the way she spoke next, surprised me. "Oh, wonderful. Ezra's been creating some incredible new works. He's really excelling recently." I'm not sure why, but it affected me deeply. I mean, I'd heard it all before. It wasn't new news, but for some reason, her conveying it with that excess of pride made me furious. She radiated pride while I was just fatting into the scenery. "I'm sure he's doing well," I said, my tone colder than I wanted it to be. I started to walk past her, but she moved into the hallway, preventing me from continuing. "Sweetheart, you should see some of his new drawings. He's been asked to be in a couple of art exhibitions, you know." I paused, feeling like I was reliving the same moment over and over. "Yeah, I get it. He's incredible. He has it all together." The irritation inside me was starting to boil over. My chest felt tight, but I managed to keep it together, or at least that's how it appeared. I might go check out that art later. I don't know why the words came out, but they did, and I saw her react. For just a moment she seemed wounded, and I couldn't tell if it was because I'd spoken sharply or because I'd finally acknowledged the obvious issue. Possibly it was both things combined. I spent the following few days attempting to understand how to handle it, how to make them comprehend what I'd been enduring for all this time, how to face the reality that I was always being overlooked while Ezra was basking in the spotlight. It was the same old situation, repeating itself endlessly. Ezra received compliments. Ezra was the center of attention. Ezra was the one everyone expressed concern for. Meanwhile, I was just present, the well-behaved child who didn't require any special treatment. I tried to disregard it, but I couldn't. I believe what truly affected me was how easy everything seemed to be for him. He never had to request anything. He didn't need to plead for his space. He didn't have to work for it. It was simply provided to him, and nobody ever questioned it. There was this one instant when Crystal everything became clearer for me. It was one of those moments when the illusion of normal just dissolves, and you finally see the truth. One afternoon, I walked back into the living room to see Ezra, in his 2-room arrangement, lying on the floor with his drawing pad. My mom, naturally, was sitting right beside him, giving him that sweet, forgiving smile that she never showed me. I can't even recall what she was. It's difficult to articulate, but I recall feeling suffocated in that space. It was like I shouldn't have been there, like I didn't fit in. That was the final push. I had to leave. I gathered my belongings, transported my possessions back to my city apartment, and tried to put some space between us. I didn't reach out, didn't check in. I desperately needed a breather, and truthfully, I was weary of pretending. I was tired of always being the accommodating one who simply accepted the story they'd invented. The story stating I wasn't deserving of the same opportunities as Ezra. I might not have completely grasped it at the time, but I was infuriated, no, absolutely livid, that my parents couldn't recognize me, couldn't see what they were doing. Several months went by. I hardly communicated with them, seldom answered their calls. I was leading my life in the city. I was working, encountering new people, trying to discover who I was outside of the good child persona they'd assigned me. However, I consistently heard about Ezra's performances, his achievements. My mother would send me images of his work, updates about his growth, small pieces of information overflowing with their pride, and these felt like slaps in the face. Each time I saw one of those photos, I felt as if I was being reminded of all my shortcomings. Then one day, everything came to a breaking point. I was in a coffee shop when my phone vibrated with a text message from my mom. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. It was a short message. "Hudson, we urgently need to have a conversation. Ezra is struggling. Could you please?" My heart sank when I read "Come home." I wasn't even sure I understood what going through something actually meant anymore. Was something wrong with him physically? Were they just being dramatic again? What fresh hell was this now? I didn't respond immediately. I was furious, incensed, actually. It had been ages since they'd acknowledged my existence, absorbed as they were in their own lives, and now they needed something from me. To help them with what? To make things better, to fix Ezra. I didn't know if I was capable of it anymore. However, I ended up doing the very thing I had vowed I'd never do. I went back. Last update. It's funny how life throws you these unexpected challenges. One moment I was in the city just living, staying away from my folks, and the very next I was on a flight back to my hometown. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other option. The hurricane had hit. It came in fast. Category 4, very unpredictable, and the news was everywhere. My parents, of course, were in the path of it. I didn't even need to get the phone call from my mom. I knew from the moment I saw all the weather alerts and flood warnings that they would reach out. And sure enough, the following day, my phone vibrated with a text from Melanie. "Hudson, please, we require your assistance. Ezra, we don't know how we'll handle this situation. The house is wrecked and we're stranded. Could you come?" I looked at the message, my finger over the reply button. There was a part of me that wanted to disregard the message, to allow them to figure it out on their own. But I wasn't that cold-hearted. Not yet. So I packed a suitcase and made my way back. When I finally opened the door, I couldn't recognize the storm had come through and ravaged our home, causing the lower levels to flood. The initial furnishings were tossed around. It was a complete mess. My folks were already holed up in the living room, appearing stressed but keeping it together as best they could. Ezra was in the corner, drawing in his sketchbook, seemingly oblivious to the chaos surrounding him. He didn't even glance up when I came in. That's just how Ezra is. He's always completely absorbed in his own thoughts. Melanie was the first to talk, giving me a forced smile. "Hudson, it's so great you came. I know all of this is overwhelming," she began, "but we could really use your help." I gave a little nod, still trying to wrap my head around everything that was happening. I wasn't anticipating some big welcome back, but I thought I'd at least get a "hey, how are you?" or something. However, there was nothing. The obvious tension between us was impossible to overlook. "Okay, well, I'm here," I said as calmly as I could. "So what do you need?" "There's not enough room for us here," she said. "Everything's wrecked downstairs. Could you let us stay at your place for a bit?" she asked, her voice full of hesitation, "just until the renovations are complete." I understood what she was truly asking. They wanted to move in, to my place. I took a breath. Honestly, a part of me wanted to lose it. A piece of me really considered unloading on her about everything she'd put me through. I thought about bringing up those long years of being treated worse than Ezra. He got 2 rooms while I got the garage. Though I had to face the truth, I wasn't that type of person anymore. I'd changed. I'd put in so much work crafting a new life for myself, and I didn't want the stuff that had happened to me back then to determine who I was now. Still, that didn't mean I couldn't get a little enjoyment out of this situation. I didn't respond right away. I strolled over to where Ezra was, still lost in his drawings, and propped myself up against the wall, watching him. He didn't glance up at me, not even once. That was typical. He was the favorite, and nobody ever told him no. That's something I still hadn't completely accepted. "Ezra," I said, making sure my voice had enough edge to get his attention. "You and Mom want to move in here, right?" Finally, Ezra glanced up, his expression puzzled. Yeah, just temporarily, of course, right? We'll be gone as soon as the house is fixed. It wasn't what he actually said, it was the way he said it, like I didn't even count, like I wasn't even a factor, like I hadn't spent years enduring the exact same treatment. Those words from before started running through my brain again. Ezra needs more room. Ezra has special needs. Ezra gets everything. The anger began to boil inside of me once more, but this time I was going to say what I felt. This time I wouldn't stop myself. Right, I replied, turning back to Melanie, who was waiting for my response. About that, there was a moment of quiet. I could tell she was steeling herself, certain I would agree. Why wouldn't I have been? I always played by the rules, always gave in, but I didn't really. Let me explain, I began, letting my words hang in the air. You and Ezra can remain. However, there are some things that need to happen first. I'm not simply going to let you waltz in here. As if absolutely nothing has happened. Melanie's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by my change in attitude. She started to object, but I cut her off. No, you're going to listen because I've had to endure years of unfairness. I've been relegated to the garage while Ezra had everything. I've been the one overlooked, and that era is over. Ezra stood up from his spot in the corner, his face displaying both bewilderment and a hint of irritation. What's your deal? Mom is just asking for some assistance, and you're acting like we've done something wrong. You've done everything wrong, Ezra, I said, staring him directly in the face. You just don't see it. You've never understood it. But maybe now you will. I could feel the atmosphere in the room become heavy. Melanie, now understanding that I wouldn't budge, came forward. Hudson, now is not the time for this. We have to concentrate on the repairs. No, we must deal with this. I interrupted, pointing at the house, at the disarray, at all of the years of anger and resentment that I'd accumulated. You and Ezra need to realize that I'm no longer going to be the compliant one. I'm not your doormat anymore. I inhaled deeply, allowing the quiet to linger. You want to stay here. The garage was where they'd be staying. That area was now theirs. Melanie seemed shocked. Ezra looked both bewildered and annoyed, yet I didn't have any feelings about it. I felt, for the initial time in ages, as if I was acting in my own best interest. I wasn't looking for an apology or attempting to be magnanimous. I was seizing command. I'd assist with fixing things, I mentioned, but this was the final time I was going to subordinate my needs for anybody. There was a significant delay. At last, Melanie let out a breath. She spoke, her tone accepting, though not completely upset. We'll figure it out, she replied. As they settled into the garage, the twist of fate wasn't lost on me. They were actually occupying my space. The space I had struggled so hard to come to terms with. The space I had made my own. However, I had, for the first time in my entire life, the feeling of winning.